So I'm here today with Biko, who's been doing some really good work on the rental/housing crisis in Australia. Some of these videos are just outstanding. It's a real shame that nobody from the mainstream media is making videos this good. So good afternoon.
Hi, Glenn.
It's a pleasure to have you here. I've been just super impressed with some of the work you've been doing. So talk me through what motivated you to make these videos.
Yeah, thanks for that. Basically, what's happened is for a period of time, I've been a homeowner, and then what happened is there was a period in my personal circumstances where I became a renter. And just going through that experience, I really started to understand how bad it is in Australia to be a renter and how many sort of barriers it creates. And then I really started to understand that there was a real clear difference in how property owners in Australia have so many benefits and I guess you could say advantages over non-property owners. And that really led me into trying to do my own research. And the more research that I did, I really started to see, well, this advantage, as you say, for property owners in regards to, policies, tax deductions and things like that, that seems to be creating a bigger and bigger wealth divide.
Yep.
And it also is starting to make it even harder for sort of future generations to get into housing. So that really started, I guess, a bit of a passion for me in researching and then making videos about the deteriorating housing affordability, especially in countries like Australia, Canada, New Zealand, where the price of property has just risen way faster than wages has, and that's created what you can see as the deteriorating affordability in those countries.
Yeah, because this was once the lucky country. I mean, you can't be a lucky country when you've got massive lines to apply for rental accommodation. And I think you make a good point. You talk about how, as a homeowner, you weren't aware of how big the problem was. I think there's a lot of people at the moment even renters, who are in very long-term leases, who aren't aware of just how bad the situation is. Sure, their rents may be going up and they may be aware of that, but I think there's very few people who are truly aware of if you're the owner of your rental sells, just how hard it is to find rental accommodation in this country. So I feel like it's a lot of the renters aren't aware of how bad the situation is, and certainly homeowners aren't. I think it's creating other problems too, though. I think one of the big problems is productivity. So a person, let's go back, say, 30 or 40 years, a person who, it was very possible for somebody, a hardworking person with a job, to buy a home and at the same time start a new business. I think the problem that we're today is the fact that it's almost one or the other. If you buy a home, because the mortgages are so high, it's literally you can't start a business and borrow the amount of money that's required to do that, even a very basic business, and have a mortgage at the same time. So literally less businesses are being created as a result of this.
Yeah, I think you're right, Glenn, because even there's sort of two sides I see to it. So less and less people, I guess, are willing to start a business. And for me, that's partly because you can invest in property and it's quite easy if you've got enough income. And then so there's less risk of investing into the property. And because property's done so well, that more and more people will continue to invest in that. So you've got less people starting the business, but you've also got less people willing to, I guess, invest in innovative, productive Australian companies or new businesses, etc.
Exactly.
Because
Yes.
everyone's basically seeing the whole tax environment for Australia encourages investment into property. because you can loan heaps more into property. And then there's proof that the Australian government and even the central bank are going to support the housing market because it's in their best interest, because it keeps the economy strong, because as people's properties go up, they spend more, they use that additional equity into their properties to buy more things, and a lot of that time is investing into more property. So we've gotten this distorted type economy that's really just skewed towards property. And like you mentioned, because of that, there's less innovation, there's less risk taking, because why would you do that when you can basically invest, make staggering returns with very little risk, because you're investing in a market supported by the government and the central bank?
Yeah, that's the big difference, isn't it? If you were to start a bakery tomorrow, you would not have effectively government backing. So the government's sort of backing the housing market, but they will not back a business like a bakery. Now, the problem like that is not just for people who don't own homes. If less people start bakeries, that means that bread becomes more expensive. Obviously, the fewer bakeries are in an area, the less competition, which allows the bakeries that are still there the ability to charge more money for the same bread, or, as we're seeing at the moment, more money for a shrinking loaf of bread.
Yeah, that's correct.
So,
And it also, I just think it also creates a crazy amount of demand for property. So it just increases demand. And then, like we were talking about the renters, renters get screwed over because more and more people just want a property to make gains, yet renters just want to own their own home. And because there's so much crazy speculative demand to try and create wealth, renters can't even afford to buy their own home now because the prices have been bid up due to that speculative demand.
So I think we're almost headed to a time now where the only way a person can buy a home is to either have a really, really good job, I'm talking $200,000 a year, or to have wealthy parents who can bankroll them to do that, or to inherit money. And I think we've got to ask the question, is that the sort of society that we want to live in, where whether you succeed or not is dependent upon what you inherit, not how hard you work and the sort of difference you're making in the world? And to me, the answer is absolutely no. That's not what Australia used to be. Now, 30, 40 years ago, this was a country where, to quote politicians, if you have a go, you'll what was it? To have a go, you'll be, I've lost it. You'll be rewarded if you have a go, sort of mentality. Now, that's not the case.
I believe in a fair go for those who have a go. And what that means is part of the promise that we all...
Now we're seeing people who just inherit money become very, very wealthy and see massive returns on their investments. And it's almost like we're becoming a nation of aspirational property owners and rent seekers, as opposed to aspirational entrepreneurs and business owners.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's really quite sad because, like you said, future generations don't have the same opportunities for home ownership that generations just 30 years ago had.
Yep.
And I mean, when you think about the 1980s and the 1990s, you only needed to have a family with one income earner who were easily able to afford a home because house prices were around 3 times the average income back then.
Yep.
So I know of many low-income earners who are easily able to buy a property and pay it off in a short amount of time. Where you fast forward, 30 years later, and it's just gotten to ridiculous levels, and the entire tax deduction type landscape and the environment we have just encourages that crazy demand, because you've got things like negative gearing and capital gains tax discount. So you've got property owners who are getting massive tax benefits, and those tax benefits encourage more demand to ensure that property goes up. So you've got great gains as well as incredibly generous tax deductions, whereas someone who doesn't own a property gets none of that. And so they pay tax on that small amount of money they might have in the bank, which makes it even harder for them to get into the property where the amazing deductions and generous benefits are.
Yeah.
And so it's really sad when future generations who aren't going to, say, inherit property from their parents start off with such a disadvantage. And we don't want to go back to, say, the 1800s, where in England, if you owned land, you were the rich, and if you didn't own land and titles, you were like a peasant.
Well, that's
exactly
exactly
the sort of direction. Yeah,
that's exactly where we're headed now. The people who will sort of bag people like me and you, they'll say it's the free market, that me and you are sort of anti-capitalist, anti-free market. But the reality is that negative gearing is not the free market. If you look up the dictionary definition of a free market, negative gearing is not the free market. Things like first homeowner grants, again, not the free market. There are so many schemes that the governments have dreamt up and executed over the last 30 years, which are completely go against these free market principles, that people will dismiss you and me, our ideas, because it's the free market. The free market's always right. Well, if you want the free market, you have to stop negative gearing and you have to stop first homeowner grants, and then it will be the free market. But at the moment, the real estate market in Australia is completely the opposite of the free market. And that's why...
Yeah, I agree.
That's why parents are telling their kids, don't invest in a business. If you're a young guy who's very good with cars, don't start your own mechanics business. That's too risky. Buy a house. That's the sort of
100%.
To me, that is not the sort of Australia that we want. We want an Australia that rewards people that start businesses, that start companies, that take risks, not people who just sit back, hoard property after property, and try and seek rents.
Absolutely, Glenn. I mean, high income earners in this country, like doctors, etc., their whole mantra, what they've been taught and what's worked, is to leverage to the hilt, so borrow as much they can into Australian property, because basically they know it's a sure bet.
Yep.
And that's not the way that investments should go.
Yeah, it's not the way to advance Australia. It may be the way to advance individuals, and that's certainly the case. But I think a big part of it too is that a lot of it, these are just paper profits. So, you've got somebody who may live in a very, what used to be considered a poor area of Melbourne, and, they bought a home for $30,000 and it's now worth $750,000. So they've got this perception and mentality that they've made all this money, when the reality is, until they sell the property, they're still in the same home. They've still got the same amount of money in the bank, or in a lot of cases, because they've spent the majority of their money on the home, they've got less money in the bank. So it's not, the profits aren't real until you sell the property. And I also think that, especially for younger people, all they know is the last sort of 30 years where real estate's gone up and up and up, rents have gone up and up and up, interest rates have stayed very low. They don't really know. I'm interested, when I talk to younger people, they don't seem to understand that there was a time in the 1980s where interest rates hit 18%. So there's a sort of a mentality that, if in the 1980s, 1990s, you were foolish if you didn't buy a home. But the other side of that is that you could buy a home and pay 18% interest on your mortgage, or you could leave your money in the bank and get 15% in interest. So
I'm going to have to head off for